First, a live viewer call-in program. We'll talk with Democratic pollster Mark Penn and former congressman and uncommitted delegate from New York, Richard Ottinger. That's a quick look at what's ahead on C-SPAN. Thank you for watching America's Network.
Welcome. I'm Nancy Newman, President of the League of Women Voters. Today's debate among the Democratic candidates for president comes at a critical juncture in the 1988 campaign. In just 3 days, voters in New York will go to the polls, and in 10 days, ballots will be cast in Pennsylvania. Building on 68 years of nonpartisan voter service, the League brings you this educational forum which is designed to help voters make informed decisions when they go to the polls. We'd like to thank the candidates for their participation, and now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderators, Bernard Shaw, CNN news anchor, and distinguished journalist Edwin Newman. Ed?
Nancy, thank you. Our debate today is among the 3 remaining active candidates for the Democratic nomination for president: Senator Albert Gore, Jr. of Tennessee.
Thank you.
The Reverend Jesse Jackson. And Governor Michael Dukakis of Massachusetts. Perhaps I should say that it is coming from the Eastman Theater in Rochester, New York. First question to Senator Gore. Senator, you believe that you're a superior candidate to Mr. Jackson and Governor Dukakis because neither of them has had experience in national government or foreign affairs. You say that George Bush would exploit that. But does not Bush have far more experience in those fields than you have, and would he not exploit that?
Well, his experience has been of the wrong kind. He was sitting right next to Ronald Reagan when they came in with the proposal to send a birthday cake to the Ayatollah Khomeini, baked in the shape of a key, and to send a Bible with an inscription to soften him up so that he would accept the proposal for trading weapons for hostages. Now, that was one of the craziest, stupidest ideas that has ever been floated in the Oval Office. George Bush sat there. He sat there right next to the president, listened to the briefing, and from all the evidence concurred in the decision to go forward with that. He was also in the Oval Office, or rather he was in the White House, when the information was made available to the executive branch that one of our loyal allies, the head of Panama, General Noriega, was involved in drug smuggling. As the head of the war against drugs, instead of raising a red flag and cutting off Noriega, seeking to pressure him from office, the administration, again, George Bush was part of it, decided to keep that information quiet, pretend it didn't matter, and go forward to continue treating him as a loyal ally. So I think his experience has been of the wrong kind, and I think he's going to have a lot of tough questions to answer in this general election campaign when we're going to beat him and elect a Democrat president this November.
Mr. Jackson, you fawned over farmers in Iowa, Texas, and elsewhere. Why have you ignored New York State farmers?
Well, it is not true. I've stood with New York State farmers as well as Iowa farmers because we've lost 650,000 family farmers in this country in the last 7 years. I've taken the initiative to fight for those farmers as they have sought supply management, as they have sought a moratorium on the foreclosures of their farms, as they have sought to negotiate a return of their land. Furthermore, I'm convinced that those family farmers fighting for fair prices are right. But those family farmers must coalesce with the workers who are fighting for fair wages. When workers fighting for fair wages and farmers fighting for fair prices unite, both can get a measure of economic justice. So I've been consistent right across the country in my basic message, and it works everywhere. Stop drugs, save jobs, secure farms, invest in our children, reinvest in America. My program message has been consistent.
Governor, the contest for the Republican nomination is effectively over. Vice President Bush has won it. The Democrats are still battling. Now, aren't you diminishing one another while Mr. Bush gets a free ride?
No, I don't think so, Ed. Providing we can keep the campaign positive and where we have our disagreements, and we do occasionally keep those disagreements friendly and respectful, I think a continued contest helps the Democrats. I think it was Abe Lincoln who once said that Democrats sounded like cats in the night, except that when you woke up in the morning, all they were doing was making more Democrats. And I think we're making more Democrats in the course of this. What we're doing is energizing people, getting the vote out. I hope bringing an enthusiasm and an idealism and a sense of purpose to this. And as we continue to campaign from state to state, the one of us, and obviously I hope it's Mike Dukakis, but the one of us who wins this nomination is going to have a network of people who have been involved, been active, and are raring to go. I don't see any intensity out there for George Bush. I don't see anyone who's ready to go through the wall for George Bush, and with good reason. Al gave you some of them. Probably a good reason why extended residence in Washington doesn't qualify you to lead American foreign policy necessarily either. But the fact is that I think the intensity, the commitment, the idealism is on the Democratic side. I agree with Al and Jesse. I think we're going to have a Democrat in the White House in 1989, and I think our competition, providing it's friendly and done the right way and the positive way, is an asset for our party.
And now we go to the segment of this debate dealing with issue questions, inviting crosstalk from the candidates and follow-up questions. Senator Gore, if you contracted AIDS or one of your children contracted AIDS, would you reveal it to the public or keep it a secret?
I have been an original co-sponsor of legislation to prevent discrimination against AIDS victims. Some persons who have contracted AIDS now are afraid that others will find out that they have the disease because there is discrimination and because there is so much unreasoning and irrational fear of the disease. We must have protections against discrimination, and we must have leadership to inform the public and everyone in this country that we have successfully defeated many diseases that are far more easily communicable than AIDS.
Senator,
but we can't be silent about it. We have to be willing to talk about it and make public the ways by which AIDS can be stopped. The prevention of AIDS is not all that complicated. But we have to have a program of education beginning in the earliest grades in school in appropriate ways and for the public generally. This administration has had a disgraceful record in failing to address the AIDS epidemic. If I might just add one thing, we must also have an approach to increasing the level of research to accelerate the finding of a cure for AIDS, and we should have leadership to alter the financing structure of our healthcare system to start dealing with the consequences of AIDS.
Well, as you're adding, I'd like you to add an answer to my question. If you Albert Gore contracted AIDS, or if one of your children contracted AIDS, would you keep it private, or would you make it public?
We see, when I started the last answer, what I was trying to say is that so long as there is discrimination against AIDS victims, and so long as there is an irrational fear of people who have AIDS, I think it's perfectly understandable that some people who have the disease would not want it known, although I think everyone has an obligation to make it known to a sex partner, for example, to if they have had a sex partner and then they find out later that they have AIDS, I think they have a responsibility to make it known to them. And I think that...
What would Albert Gore do?
Well, what would... I mean, but you see, the question is like, if you had cancer, would you make it public? If you had some other disease, would you make it public? I might choose, for reasons of my own, not to make it public. So you don't see, the thrust of your question is kind of you know, is there something wrong with you if you have AIDS and choose not to make it public? I don't wish to respond in personal terms, because I would confront that situation and make a decision at that time. I think I would feel like you know, but speaking in defense of the many thousands of victims, there are 54,000 victims of AIDS in the United States today.
This raises a question, and I know, Mr. Jackson, you want to say something about this. If there are 54,000 victims of AIDS, is fear of AIDS irrational?
I think the kind of fear of AIDS we have now is irrational, because some people are actively spreading the notion that it can be contracted by shaking hands with someone or by having some kind of casual contact. Some small school children have been excluded from schools because they have AIDS. That kind of fear is irrational. But it's not irrational to say we've got to have a nationwide effective response to AIDS with an education and prevention campaign aimed at all 240 million Americans.
Mr. Jackson.
If it were put to me in a personal way, I support confidentiality of the testing of AIDS. I would tend to make it public as a matter of helping with the healing process to break down the hysteria. And so I affirm the handshake and the embrace by shaking the hands of people who I know, who have AIDS, who are dying, who by their dying, others might live if it stimulates research. October the 11th, when 600,000 gay and lesbian people marched in Washington, and their friends and relatives, I chose to go to that demonstration and to be with people who are dying from AIDS, and people who support them, as a way of a public leader showing commitment to end the hysteria, end the irrationality, and stop trying to make AIDS and homosexuals correspond, because the AIDS epidemic can no longer be linked just to one group by race, by sex preference. It's an international health epidemic, and we had very well, based on its danger, invest the necessary research in it to find a cure for the AIDS disease.
Governor, you?
It seems to me one of the responsibilities of a president is to provide leadership in this area, to create an environment within which we understand the disease and what it means, which we reach out to people with AIDS, in which we do what Alice said, which is to begin comprehensive health education in the early elementary grades in this country on drugs, on AIDS, on the things that our kids are going to confront. I spent about an hour last night at a place called Bailey House in New York City, which is one of the few residences for people with AIDS that I know of anywhere in the country. And one of the residents told me that a few days ago, he had gone down the street to a dry cleaner to get a suit pressed. And the person in the dry cleaning shop had said, well, where do you live? And he said, 180 Christopher Street. And he said, well, I don't think I can take your suit. I mean, if it's gotten to that, or somebody who has this disease can't even go in and get a suit pressed or buy something or continue to live his or her life in dignity, then we've got some work to do in this country, and it starts in the White House. That's where the leadership has to begin.
I'm sorry, we have to go to the next question, which goes to you. Mr. Jackson, you proposed to freeze the defense budget for 5 years. You've said that. How would that work? How would the money in the defense budget now be allocated?
Well, we would essentially keep the systems that we have. We would not freeze systems unilaterally. But there's a 5-year freeze in the present defense budget. The context is we increased military spending by $150 billion when Mr. Reagan came in office. We're now spending $150 billion a year defending Europe and Japan 42 years after the war. They're spending 20% less of their share of the burden 7 years later. Clearly, they can help share the burden of their own defense and allow us resources for other investment, including infrastructure. If we keep the freeze for 5 years, we'll still be militarily superior, but we'll be saving $60 billion a year by 1993. We must bring the budget deficit down to have resources available for investment in infrastructure and human services.
Would you change any of the allocation within the budget?
Well, the first issue, of course, is to deal with cost overruns, to deal with sole source contracts, to make a commitment not to deploy Star Wars. We'd have to make some judgment on priorities once you have information classified and unclassified. But at the very outset, we know very well we have 13 aircraft task forces. The Soviets have one. We do not need 2 more at $36 billion. We do not need to deploy Star Wars. We know that now. We know right now that Europe and Japan, while they're in a creditor status and we're in a debtor status, are better able to share their burden. I will not stand idly by and watch bridges close in New York City and no affordable housing being built in our country and no higher minimum wage for working people while making that kind of expenditure to defend Europe and Japan without them pulling their share of the burden.
As a practical matter, whoever is the next president of the United States will face a period of relatively flat defense budgets. That is, there will not be real increases in the defense budget just because the Reagan-Bush administration has undermined and virtually destroyed the consensus in favor of a stable, consistent policy on national security. And their overall economic policy has resulted in such enormous deficits that there's pressure on every single part of the budget. But to be specific in answering your question, I would change priorities within the defense budget and eliminate wasteful and unnecessary programs like the Bradley fighting vehicle, for example, cut back and restructure programs like the very expensive LHX helicopter program to have a single prototype instead of 3. I won't go into the details on that. Reform the military procurement system, reduce the amount of money allocated to SDI, and keep it within the constraints of this anti-ballistic missile treaty, which is so important to our future security. But this administration, which came into office with Ronald Reagan touting the fact that he had never been tainted by experience in Washington, has been the most irresponsible in managing the defense budget and the overall budget than any administration in the history of this country.
Governor, Governor Dukakis,
well, and just to follow up on what Al and Jesse have said, no matter who the next president is, the defense budget in real terms isn't going to grow. So some very hard choices have got to be made within that existing budget. We have a massive nuclear arsenal. There are serious questions about our conventional capability. Can't drive our tanks more than 3/4 of a mile in Europe on maneuvers because our tank commanders are running out of fuel. We're losing our own war games in the Mojave Desert to the Soviet side because our guns are misfiring. The Air Force is now complaining that spare parts, maintenance, flight time for pilots isn't adequate to maintain the kind of strength we need. So that in addition to getting the waste out of there and the duplication, there are going to have to be some very serious choices made within what, as Al points out, is going to be a stable number no matter who the president is, and that's a job that the next president's going to have.
See, what I'm convinced
a very brief comment,
what I'm convinced of, we cannot just manage Reaganomics. We're going to have to reverse Reaganomics. It has created tremendous damage. The doubling of the military budget in peacetime, $150 billion a year, the $600 billion tax break, that combination has us in this deficit, debt, trade imbalance crisis. So we must dispel the notion that bigger military budget makes us more secure. We are less secure in Latin America today, more chaotic in the Middle East, and more death in South Africa. So in effect, we have guided missiles, but misguided leadership, and that's critical to our future.
Governor, former President Nixon says of General Secretary Gorbachev, quote, "Only a heavyweight should get into the ring with him." How much do you weigh?
Well, I've been a chief executive for 10 years. And when you're a chief executive of an important state for 10 years, you meet a lot of people across the table. You have to pick cabinets, you have to appoint judges, you have to run a government, you have to balance budgets, you have to work with legislators. You've got to make things happen. And if there's one strength I bring to this campaign, to the presidency, it is as a doer. Somebody who's created jobs, who's led a government, and who's helped to lead a state into what I think most people agree is one of the strongest and the best economic situations we have in any state in the country. I look forward to negotiating with Mr. Gorbachev. For one thing, I like to negotiate against tough people and with tough people. For another, I think the situation in the Soviet Union, which is very serious domestically, and at this point, we really don't know what Gorbachev will do. Will he last? Can he do what he's trying to do in restructuring domestically? Has given us the best opportunity for meaningful arms control and arms reduction we've had in our lifetimes.
A question arises.
And I'd love to have the opportunity to negotiate.
A question arises out of that before Mr. Jackson speaks. Should we be helping Mr. Gorbachev to bring about his reforms?
I think it's in our best interest, Ed, to negotiate in a way which is in our national interest. And I don't think there's any question that negotiating deep cuts in strategic weapons and a test ban treaty and getting going on discussions about the reduction in conventional forces in Europe with deeper cuts on the Soviet side is in our national interest. Now, if it also happens to be in the Soviet interest, so be it. But I don't think there's any question that this opportunity is a rare one. It's an opportunity that no president has had, at least since World War II, and I welcome it. I'd love to have the chance to do it.
We do have to go on to the next question.
Mayor, an insecure,
2 sentences.
An insecure, unstable Soviet Union is a greater threat to us. Because if they're insecure and unstable with their missile stockpile, it jeopardizes the whole world. And so moving from inciting rhetoric like evil empire to a more mature position like negotiating an INF agreement and then going to Russia to negotiate deeper cuts, mutually verifiable, that is the safe, secure, and mature thing for an American president to do.
I'd like to comment on the original question. I've already met and talked with Mikhail Gorbachev. I think that he may be offering the possibility of something genuinely new in the U.S.-Soviet relationship. I think it's important for the voters next Tuesday, for the people of this country, to take into account in making the decision on who should be the next president of the United States, who of the three of us on stage has the experience and the ability to best explore whether or not Gorbachev is really offering something new. I've worked extensively in this area. I've put forward a comprehensive approach that has received wide discussion and debate within the Soviet Union as well as here in the United States. I believe I know what to do and how to go about it. Mistakes on the campaign trail on strategic policy can be corrected and modified during the course of the campaign. Mistakes during a summit meeting, mistakes during the conduct of strategic policy are something else again. We need a president of the United States who has experience and who has the capability to do that job well. and to explore this possibly unprecedented opportunity with Gorbachev.
Is that why you were trying to help him correct what you thought was a mistake earlier in this campaign, his primary?
I think one of the purposes of primary campaigns is to vigorously explore differences on the issues, and as a dialogue in the campaign takes place, I think that all the candidates have an opportunity to put their best foot forward and to strengthen what some might perceive as weaknesses. And yes, I have raised issues in contrast to my approach.
We do have to push on.
I was trying to respond to his question, but that's fine.
I understand, but the lights, time lights are blinking up here. Senator, you told the New York Times a few days ago that we could save money by eliminating $40 billion worth of unnecessary medical diagnostics a year. You said that you could provide a list of 15 procedures that health specialists agree are pure waste. What are some of them, and would you simply have the government refuse to pay for them?
Well, the $40 billion a year I referred to is all spent by the federal government. If you look at the amount spent on unnecessary tests and inappropriate procedures in the private sector, the figure is actually far larger than that. I have worked extensively in the area of health care policy. In fact, I was just endorsed here in New York yesterday by Mr. Health in the New York State Legislature, Jim Talon, who is a national leader in this area. The unnecessary tests would include, for example, routine chest x-rays when somebody has to be admitted to the hospital. Doctors agree widely that is unnecessary and gives no benefit, carries with it a risk. This nation spends $2 billion a year on that. Unnecessary EKGs, a whole series of unnecessary blood tests. And in the area of procedures that are often inappropriately ordered, coronary bypasses are frequently ordered in circumstances where the vast majority of doctors say that's unnecessary.
This is within the government, you're saying.
That is correct.
Veterans Administration,
well, you see, 50%,
military?
Absolutely. 50% of all health care spending comes from the taxpayers in Medicare and Medicaid and the Veterans Administration and CHAMPUS. And so savings that the country makes in health care expenditures translate directly to benefits to the taxpayers. Now, a lot of those savings, or some of those savings, would appropriately be plowed back into more efficient health procedures.
How would you prevent these tests and other procedures from being undertaken?
Well, I have been the principal sponsor of legislation in the United States Senate that would establish guidelines for procedures when Medicare and Medicaid would reimburse, and where procedures and tests are totally inappropriate and the medical professionals agree that they're not only unnecessary but occasionally harmful, then they shouldn't be reimbursed. If they're not paid for, then you're going to see them stop. You know, the profit motive has a lot to do with this. If people can make a lot of money by ordering a completely unnecessary test, then they're going to do it. Now, some of it is malpractice defense. There are a lot of factors involved. But the fact is we can save an enormous amount of money by eliminating wasteful spending in this area.
Wouldn't it be fair to say, in all due respect, a more fundamental question? Al knows the details of how to defend the proposition he has put forth. But the critical issue is that today there are 38 million Americans with no health insurance.
Mine or yours?
That's yours. And 2.5 million people in New York with no health insurance. People are literally dying in admitting offices because they don't have a green or yellow card to go upstairs to a bed that's empty waiting for somebody with insurance to get sick. Which raises the fundamental issue of moving toward a national health care system for everybody. And in my judgment, that certainly involves more home care as opposed to just hospital care. It involves capping some costs. It involves more focus on preventive care and not just after the fact care. But I think what Al has worked on and what Dukakis put together is a rather comprehensive system in my judgment in his own state. We must move to a system that serves people based upon need, not just based upon money.
There's no greater priority for this country. 40 years after Harry Truman first suggested that it was time for this country to join all of the other industrialized nations in the world, with the exception of South Africa, and guarantee basic health security to our citizens. We still have, as Jesse points out, nearly 40 million people in this country that don't have one dime of basic health insurance, and we're not talking about folks on welfare. They get Medicaid. We're talking about working families. Next week, I'm going to sign the first bill in the history of this country to guarantee basic health insurance to every single citizen in my state. And it's time we had that for every citizen in this country.
Mr. Jackson, last night Americans raced the clock to meet their responsibility. Why has it taken your organization, Push Excel, so long to repay the federal government what it owes?
Well, we've been in 6 years of debate between lawyers and accountants on allowables and disallowables, which is rather standard operating procedure. In their contesting of the organization, they never question anything that's illegal, allowables and disallowables. We could have taken the Chapter 11 route out. We chose the honorable route out. And when we conclude this process, if we owe them some money, they will be paid. And if they owe us some money, then they will pay us.
How long?
Very difficult to say. It's the kind of give and take procedure. In part, the administrative red tape of this government is a factor. Suffice it to say that we have a good accounting system, that we're in a procedure, and as soon as it is over, then we will settle it. And fortunately for us, we have served. Push Excel has motivated more youth than any organization in this country to avoid drugs and babies making babies and violence and suicide. And that contest with this administration over allowables and disallowables, a bookkeeping or procedure has not stopped our work to serve the children.
Governor Dukakis, you said that the CIA paid General Noriega of Panama $200,000 a year. When did the CIA do that? Why did it do it, and for how long?
I can't give you the details on that, Ed, and I think this administration has a responsibility to the people of this country to tell us how much, who paid, who was dealing with Noriega. Yesterday, the Vice President informed us that Libya was aiding Noriega, cited U.S. intelligence sources. How about telling us who in this administration was dealing with Noriega? Who was paying Noriega? Who was ignoring the fact that we knew he was dealing in drugs and making millions, and we were still doing business with him? And I think the people of this country deserve that explanation. If they don't, then we ought to have a full congressional investigation of it.
But you're certain of this figure, $200,000 a year paid by the CIA to Noriega?
The best evidence we have is that that amount of money was paid to him for some period of time.
Senator,
is it your view that Noriega should be pushed out by the United States?
It's my view that the United States should encourage human rights and democracy in this hemisphere and all over the world. We should do so in close collaboration with our democratic allies and neighbors in Central and Latin America. That applies to Panama, applies to Central America, it applies to Chile, Paraguay, anywhere where people in this world and in this hemisphere are being denied human rights, the right to live in a democracy and to exercise individual freedom.
Senator Gore and then Mr. Jackson.
I thought it was kind of funny that George Bush started talking about Gaddafi supporting Noriega on the same day that Gaddafi announced his public endorsement of George Bush to be President of the United States. That may be an endorsement he doesn't want. But really and truly...
Maybe he can't refuse it.
Really and truly, this is an outrage. They declared war against drugs, and then the next day they cut the money in half. They said they wanted to be tough against countries that were serving as the source of illegal drugs, and yet the evidence being developed by the Senate committee investigating this matter now indicates clearly that those leaders and individuals in Latin America who were being helpful in the Contra war were treated very differently from other leaders and individuals. And where they had clear, unmistakable evidence that people like General Noriega were getting wealthy, smuggling drugs to the children of the United States of America, they made a conscious decision to keep that information secret, to sweep it under the rug, because they made a choice that helping the Contras was more important to them than stopping that source of illegal drugs to this country. They ought to be held accountable for that choice.
I talked 2 days ago with Oscar Arias from Costa Rica and asked him about our approach in Panama. He told me, as he had told the newspaper editors, that if we, in fact, want to keep Noriega in power and turn the people of that country against us, keep using this unilateral approach, and that will almost guarantee it. What we've done, we've set the forest on fire to smoke one man out who's insulated. But the common people of Panama are suffering. They don't have currency and food and medicine, and they're now losing hope. It seems to me that we are so involved in that arrangement. We need to have a Latin American summit conference with our own country, perhaps in Mexico, and look at a comprehensive multilateral approach. There is no one-person solution to the depth of $150 billion a year drug habit our country has. Don't just focus on the children. Children are not buying $100 billion worth of drugs a year, and ball players are not laundering $100 billion worth of drugs a year. This is the number one threat to our national security. It does not lend itself to a quick fix, unilateral, satisfy tomorrow's headline approach.
You three Democrats have been here blaming the Reagan administration, but just for the purpose of historical accuracy, I would like a concession from you, Senator, and you, Mr. Jackson, you, Governor, that in fact the black channel of drugs being handled by the leaders of Panama, that channel goes well beyond the Reagan administration. In fact, the United States Senate held a secret hearing on the charges against General Torrijos and his brother Moises in the negotiation of the Panama Canal Treaty. So it's not just a Republican administration that has looked the other way. You do concede that.
Well, I don't know what makes the channel black when the powder is white. We're talking about cocaine.
Well, I'm just talking about
point A,
the line that goes beyond, it goes beyond the past 8 years.
But we're not talking about the nature of parties, we're talking about the character of administrations.
Well,
this administration
against the administration in power. That's the only reason.
Let me respond to the question. It's a legitimate question. In fact, this problem is much bigger than partisan politics. That's true. And the problem has been, but I want to respond.
Please.
It has been developing over a long period of time. We have 5% of the people in the world. We now consume 50% of the illegal and dangerous drugs in the world. But here is the point. During the last 8 years, during the watch of the Reagan-Bush administration, the awareness of this great democracy of ours has been aroused. We have, for the first time, really focused on why this is such a serious problem and has to be addressed, and we've cried out for leadership from the only place where it can really effectively come, from the White House. And what they have given us is rhetoric and hypocrisy. They've given us a verbal war against drugs and proposals to cut the money, and they've shaken their fist at foreign countries in a way that wasn't done before because the awareness wasn't the same before, and yet at the same time they were shaking their fist, they were covering up the information that was made available to them and continuing to treat them in public as if they were honored, loyal allies.
Senator, I've heard every word you've said, and I don't want to seem curt, but I have to move on to...
That doesn't seem curt at all. You can do that.
Okay. Governor, should the Federal Reserve Board raise or lower interest rates now?
Well, that depends on the economic situation today, tomorrow, next week, next month.
We're talking about the situation as we know it of last Thursday.
Well, we have a very, very serious economic problem facing us. The President of the United States in 1981 convinced the Congress that you could raise defense spending, cut taxes, and balance the budget. If I or any other chief executive in this country ever went to our legislators and made that proposition to them, we'd either be thrown out of the place or laughed out of the place, but it happened. We ran up these massive federal deficits. We had to borrow from abroad billions and billions of dollars. We're up to our eyeballs in hock, and now we have to keep interest rates up there for fear that if we don't, we're not going to be able to borrow these billions from Japanese and other bankers to pay our bills. That's why one of the first responsibilities of the next president will be to get that deficit down, to get us off this necessity for continuing to borrow billions abroad so that we can begin to have some fiscal and monetary policies that make sense. I'd like to get interest rates down in this country. I think the cost of capital is much too high. It's a serious disadvantage to our ability to be competitive in the world. It's hurting young families that are trying to buy houses. It's hurting small business people.
But in this context, should the Fed raise or lower interest rates?
If we can get a president who can work with the Congress to begin to bring the deficit down, then I want to see interest rates come down at the same time.
I think it's also important to note that we need to keep the Fed independent, but more cooperation between the Fed and our governmental policy. But also, it cannot just be that anymore. There must be greater cooperation between our government and West Germany and Japan, because we now live in a global economy. And no longer can we make unilateral moves without having some sense of currency and exchange rates balanced around the world to really make it effective.
Senator?
My preference is for lower interest rates, but the point made...
Now?
Yes, I'd like to see it, but the point made by Mike Dukakis and the point made by Jesse Jackson are both valid. Interest rates or monetary policy cannot be seen in isolation from fiscal policy and the other economic facts of life. And what's happened in this administration is they have gone hog wild in fiscal policy and caused us to borrow $500 million every 24 hours, and then put so much pressure on monetary policy to control the results of that we have these unreasonably high interest rates and real interest rates. So you have to bring interest rates down in conjunction with a more sensible fiscal policy. At the same time, what Reverend Jackson says is also true. Look at Germany. They have a 2.5% inflation rate now and a 9.5% unemployment rate. That is irresponsible in the context of the current world economy. They have to work with us as Japan has to work with us. In order to bring interest rates down, therefore, we have to have a more sensible fiscal policy and greater cooperation from our allies.
May I add one other point? The prime rate in Japan is less than 3%. It's 8.5% in this country. Think of the enormous burden that imposes on our ability to compete internationally. Less than 3% in Japan, 8.5% in the United States.
And when the dollar fell here, which had some value, without getting South Korea and Taiwan to adjust their exchange rates, it still kept us in a weakened position, or without some leverage to, in fact, focus on more market share for long-term development as opposed to just 3-month quality profit returns. I think you've kind of opened up a barrel of economic concerns that we have, which is my bottom line, because we cannot just massage Reaganomics and manage it. We must reverse it to gain our sense of economic stability again.
I know it's a very deep barrel, but I yield to Ed.
Large barrel. Mr. Jackson, you have in the past embraced Yasser Arafat, called President Assad of Syria a humanitarian. In Havana, you've shouted, "Viva Castro, viva Che Guevara," and you've shouted to Castro's followers, "Your struggle is our struggle." Now, is it your position that all of this is in the past and should be ignored?
Well, it should be at least put in perspective. The Pope met with Arafat as well, for the purpose not to arm him, but to appeal to him to recognize Israel's right to exist with secure borders, to appeal to him to move away from any act of threat of terrorism to mutual recognition in exchange for mutual security.
Now, you said
and land for peace.
The Pope did that. Did you do that?
Because as a moral leader, it was the right thing to do. I met with him and made the same basic appeal.
Now,
after having met with Sadat, Sadat said to me, "I want you to go back," since I was meeting with him in Egypt, "to Lebanon and meet with Arafat and appeal to him to do that which I have done." And I did that. It was the right thing to do. To help secure Israel, we must convince Israel's adversaries to make a basic adjustment. There's a move to a mutual recognition. It was the thing to do. I have met lastly with our allies and our adversaries.
If you shouted "Your struggle is our struggle" to Castro's followers, what did you mean by that?
Well, first of all, Assad, when I was able to get Gutman out of jail, the least I could tell them was, "Thanks, this is a humanitarian act. Let me take the American pilot back home." I thanked him and left. In the case of Castro, I brought Americans and Cubans back home. No one else has done that. Got him to embrace the Contadora process publicly. I got him to accept the releasing and the return of Mariel prisoners. It was simply my appeal for us to expand our impact in this hemisphere. If we can have negotiations and diplomatic relations with Chile and South Africa on the one hand, and China and Russia on the other, we should not reduce our influence in our own hemisphere with Cuba. It is what we ought to do.
Senator.
I have some basic disagreements on some of these questions. I do not believe that the United States of America should negotiate, for example, with the PLO. Now, there have been some modifications in the position that was articulated by Jesse Jackson, and I've said, I think it's a step forward. But I do not believe the law prohibiting that ought to be changed unless the PLO renounces terrorism, accepts the United Nations resolutions 242 and 338, and recognizes Israel's right to exist. That is not an onerous burden to meet. If you're going to negotiate on the future of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip or whatever, it seems to me a minimal condition for them to acknowledge the right of their negotiating partner to exist. Now, I think it's useful and productive for us to have a dialogue on these issues. And I think that it's important for the next President of the United States to move the peace process forward with justice for all of the parties in the Middle East and with the Camp David process as the chosen vehicle for making progress.
Governor, and then Mr. Jackson.
I don't see why it's so difficult for an Arafat or any of the other Arab leaders to get up and do what Sadat did in 1979. To get up and simply say, yes, we believe the people of Israel have the right to exist within secure borders and to live in dignity and freedom. We accept resolutions 242 and 338, and we will negotiate on that basis.
Governor,
why is that so difficult?
Let me make one.
Why is that so difficult?
That is not what Sadat did.
Mr. Jackson,
just a moment, Brian.
I just want to interject one point. Partly, or possibly, one difference might be that Sadat is dead.
No, but
I'm not being facetious.
I think there's a more basic reason.
No question about it.
Yeah.
No, but I talked with Sadat about why he went. He didn't just simply get up and go because he had a spiritual insight. He went to Israel with land for peace in his pocket. Because we, in fact, even though Egyptians had killed Israelis and vice versa, we reserved the right to talk and convinced Sadat that the mutual recognition for mutual security and land for peace was a way to gain for himself land back and more security for Israel. In the case of the PLO, we have opted not to talk. Since we can't talk, we can't act. Since we can't act, we can't influence. So we're now having to go to an international peace conference, which I support, which involves indirect talks. When it's all said and done, if you cannot talk with your enemy, you can't stop your enemy from being your enemy.
But if
you must be tough negotiators.
But if they...
Wait a second.
Forgive me, we have time for one brief comment from Senator Gore, one brief comment from Governor Dukakis, and then a question that Bernie will be asking.
But if one of the parties fails to make the basic concession that terrorism, such as blowing up school buses with innocent children on them, renouncing that kind of act as an instrument of politics, is a minimal condition, I think, for our willingness to say, yes, we will sit down and talk with you and recognize you as a responsible party in this discussion. I don't think it's unreasonable to ask them to do that.
You are right. I absolutely accept that proposition. But last week when Mr. Shamir said he wouldn't recognize the PLO, even if they recognized him, suggests that you have such a locked situation, then what we must do is a difficult thing, is to try to get both of them to enough mutual security to make the break that neither one of them has the strength to make. And what we did with Egypt and Israel, we did for them what neither could do for the other. We talked with both. And we did not threaten to cut aid from Israel or threaten to cut aid from the Egyptians. We offered them more aid for them to make that break. We must be that kind of leader, in my judgment.
With all due respect to Jesse, I don't think you can possibly equate Sadat's attitude with the attitude of the PLO. They're poles apart.
I just want to impose a small amount of discipline here by saying that if the answers are not short, you will not get to make your closing statements.
And we're all waiting for that. Senator.
That would be a great tragedy, I'm telling you.
We might even agree to give them up. Senator, would you by federal law enforce this proposition: if a company cannot completely and safely dispose of chemical and solid waste, that company should not be in business?
I have written the law along with one other principal author of the Superfund law and amendments to the other major law in this area, which requires that companies improperly disposing of hazardous waste must bear the financial consequences of cleaning it up. And as a practical matter, that can already be done under present law, because the costs of cleaning up irresponsible disposal are very large. Let me tell you where this started. It happened right here in this state. A few days ago, I went back to Love Canal. 10 years ago, I had the first hearings ever held in this country on hazardous chemical waste disposal, and we looked at Love Canal. After 40 more hearings, I helped to write the law to prevent the irresponsible disposal of waste. Now, this administration came into office 1 month after that law went into effect. They appointed Rita Lavelle to head the Superfund. She had a change of address to the federal penitentiary. They appointed James Watt. They appointed James Watt to head the Interior Department and Ann Burford to head the EPA. They became known as the Bonnie and Clyde of environmental protection. Now, environmental protection used to be a bipartisan issue until this crowd took over. And they have made it a partisan issue that the American people are going to hold them responsible for in the November election.
Senator, in fairness to your colleagues, I'd like to hear the attitude.
I wanted to say in all
we have about 2 minutes to closing statements, so guide yourself accordingly.
Al has answered that question thoroughly, but I must say to you, this is a League of Women Voters debate, and we've not discussed women at all. It's important that half of the nation's poor children live in a house headed by a woman where there is no man. Unless we raise minimum wage and pay for women.
Mr. Jackson,
forgive me, this would be more appropriate, if I may say so, for a closing statement. Any discussion on the environment here?
Well, I think women and children are affected by the environment every bit as much as men.
Really? And I think it is really basically unfair, in my judgment, given the impact. I mean, Al answered that question in great detail. We've got to talk, I think, about...
Okay, let's do it this way. If everybody
comment on the environment?
Yes, on the environment, or if I may say so,
if a company or a producer of toxic and hazardous waste can't dispose of it safely, then they can't continue to do business. I mean, that's the law. Now, I've had many situations where we've helped them to do it in a way that helped them to meet the deadlines and meet the timetables. But if they continue to produce hazardous and toxic waste that is poisoning people and poisoning neighborhoods and poisoning communities, then they've got to go out of business.
All right, gentlemen, closing statements, 1 minute each. There are light signals up here.
There are the lights.
When the yellow light goes on, it's 15 minutes to close. So
15 minutes?
15 seconds, I beg your pardon. I am undone. Mr. Jackson, would you go first, then Senator Gore, then Governor Dukakis?
This has been a campaign of hope. We broadened the base of Democratic participation. You've gotten people involved who have not been involved in this process before. Now, Tuesday, you must really make a judgment. Presidents set the moral tone, and they offer leadership. If you were going to face the threat of your job being closed tomorrow, who would you want to argue your case? If you wanted someone to motivate your children to resist drugs, who would you want to argue your case? If you were a farmer about to face foreclosure, who would you want to argue your case? If you had a relative in a foreign jail, who would you want to seek to gain your relative's freedom? Leadership must dare to act. I dare to act and make a difference. I want to keep America strong and make America better. I don't want to massage Reaganomics or manage it. I want to reverse Reaganomics and turn our government back to honorable and common people. Thank you very much.
Senator.
This is one of the most important elections for the White House we've ever had in this country, and people are focusing on one simple question: who can best guide this nation? Who has the experience to take advantage of the possibly unprecedented opportunities for reversing the arms race in a verifiable way? Who has the record of successfully winning battles in behalf of working men and women? I want to put the White House back on the side of working families. I want to pursue three goals in this nation: economic growth, to provide more and better jobs, and to restore our nation's economic strength. Secondly, social justice, to make progress in civil rights and equal rights, to stand by Social Security, expand accessibility to health care, and promote environmental protection. And third, to see this nation play an intelligent role in the world as a whole. Don't vote on the basis of fear. Vote on the basis of hope. Cast a positive vote. I ask for your support in this Tuesday's election.
This Tuesday, the people of New York are going to have an opportunity to make a very important decision. I hope you'll look at the three of us and ask yourself, which of us will be our party's strongest nominee, which one of us can beat Vice President Bush in the fall, and which one of us will be the best president. I have no interest in running for the presidency to become the great communicator. I want to be a great builder. I want to be a president who builds a full employment America that provides good jobs and good wages for all of our citizens. An America that ends the shame of homelessness by building housing for families of low and moderate income once again. An America that provides basic health insurance for its citizens, that cleans up its environment, that educates its kids, and that wages a real war and not a phony war against drugs. An America that is a strong and responsible international leader whose foreign policy reflects America's